Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Tech Bubble, the podcast that focuses on digital literacy and technology, all within the context of our own South Island School. I'm your host, Ian Williamson, and joining me today, we are joined by 6 guests. Well, kind of sort of, as you'll see. Our focus today explores the relationship between technology and pedagogy. For our younger listeners, the word pedagogy means the kind of teaching and learning, the methods which are being used in your lessons. So, should be interesting. First up, we have Carolyn Andrews, one of our vice principals, overseeing teaching and learning at South Island School. Wow, that's quite a title you've got there, Carolyn. No pressure there then. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
With Carolyn, we are joined by my long-term colleague in the Film and Media Department, Larisa Curran, editor extraordinaire, and as sometimes you can see in her signature of her emails, the Queen of Digital Badges. Welcome, Larisa.
Hi, very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and I hope you're going to give me a badge for this.
That sounds like a job for the DLC, by the way, Larisa. Many of you will know that since the arrival of Carolyn Andrews at South Island, our transition between the feeder primary schools, Quarry Bay and Bradbury, and our school has really transformed. The last 18 months, the DLC has been getting in on the act, providing some digital citizenship training for the younger students provided by our own digital leaders. As part of this process, we felt that it would be fun this week to invite a representative from both schools to talk about the impact of technology in the classroom for our primary peers. We also have Matt Hayes, the technology innovation leader from Quarry Bay School. Matt and I have been working closely together over the last few months, and indeed we've had some transitional activities involving the South Island digital leaders in May, which we may well discuss later in the show. Plus, I have to say, I like your title, Matt. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks very much. It's great to be able to connect with you at South Island School on the podcast today.
And we also have Stephen Fennelly, the Vice Principal at Bradbury School and former Digital Literacy Coordinator a few years ago when I first met him. Or to be more specific, Stephen has actually pre-recorded some responses to a few questions that I've asked prior to the show, as he is currently interviewing some potential new students for Bradbury School. So good luck to the students and the parents involved in that process today. Finally, we've got 2 of our own students on the show. First, we've got Manya Khanduri of 12S1. Manya was part of the Diwali Night head team, acting as the head of publicity for the event. And this is your first time on the show, Manya, so welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And last, but by no means least, we've got Adrian Wong from 12B2, a member of the DLC and part of the Baha'i leadership team with a role on the Student Council, and even a debater to boot. So welcome to the Tech Bubble, Adrian.
I'm very happy to be in the show. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. For those of our listeners who have already had the chance to download episode 2, you'll know that I ended the show by asking, what should we keep from our online learning experience when we eventually get back to school? What do you think, Carolyn? What should we keep when hopefully later on in May, we're back here at South Island School?
I would believe that there's a lot of very good things that we should keep. But one of the things that I have found in just noticing my own children as they're working, they seem to be much more intrinsically motivated and they're steering their own course, so to speak. Whereas before, they would look immediately to the teacher or their peers for some kind of support or some acknowledgement that they're on the right track. Whereas now they don't have that as much. They do have it if, the open Zooms and they're talking to one another. But a lot of times I find that they're taking a lot more of their own personal responsibility towards their own learning. And that relationship between teacher and student, I think, has changed. So as a teacher, I have to trust that my kids are getting on with it and that they will ask questions if they need support. They're not relying on each other as much. I found when I'm in the classroom, I can maybe overstep my bounds and offer help too quickly. Whereas that's not happening now. And I find the kids are rising to that challenge. So I'm coming into my lessons now with a bit of a view of they are responsible for their own learning and they can rise to that challenge. It's been a remarkable journey, I have to say. Tough, but I think it's been a very, very good one for all of us.
We'll hear in a moment from Matt and also from Stephen how that's paralleled in the primary sector. But before we do that, in many ways there, Carolyn is giving us the student viewpoint there. Larisa, what about from the kind of teacher perspective for you? How do you think that the online learning experience has been so far? And what should we keep?
I'm so glad that you've asked me this question. I've actually just written an article for the tests about exactly this. And the key takeaway for me is that we need to build on this momentum that we've created to build a truly 21st century education that sees technology not just as an optional lecturer, but as an equal part of what it means to be a truly great teacher. And when I was researching this, I discovered that there's evidence of 3 key success factors in integrating technology for positive outcomes. And 3 of those are A, teacher openness to change, B, professional development, and C, strength of leadership. So regarding teacher openness to change, we've experienced an unprecedented, rapid and enforced period of professional development since school closed. And teachers have risen to that challenge. They've been open to finding other ways to deliver their curriculum using technology. They've been willing to experiment, take risks and collaborate, and started to be perhaps more creative and playful in the way that the curriculum is delivered. And I think there's signs that they've been enjoying it as well. In terms of professional development, I think finally we have an opportunity to build on professional development that focuses on using the educational technology to move beyond simply enhancing learning activities to actually transforming them. And as teachers, if we do want to provide a 21st century education, we have to continue to develop our understanding of how we can effectively use technology to achieve learning outcomes. It's not enough to, as teachers, to combine our knowledge of pedagogy with our knowledge of our content, our subject matter. Technology is part of our world. It's very much part of our students' world, and it's part of how they communicate and how they learn about the world. And then finally, in terms of those 3 success factors, the strength of leadership. And we've seen that increasingly during these last 12 weeks, I think it is now, a commitment to the integration of technology into teaching and learning. And I think we can build on that by creating a coaching culture that meets teachers where they're at, especially now that they've started to really build their skills in this way. But there is one final thing, and this connects to what Carolyn was saying, and this is learner agency. So what we've seen is that the use of technology increases motivation and engagement, and I would argue it's because we are giving students control over their learning. So we can continue to do things like using the technology to enable student choice, self-pacing, allowing them to develop independence, using things like digital choice boards, learning playlists, learning menus. And also, the research shows that the best outcomes arise from using technology with others. So we must continue to emphasize collaboration.
I mean, it's very interesting there to hear you, Larisa, talking about what you and I would probably recognize as the SAMR model, this idea of transforming through technology rather than simply a substitute for what's already there. For instance, in the old days, we'd have used bits of paper. This is for some of our younger listeners, perhaps, who are wondering what this means. And then, of course, nowadays we use Google Docs. And really what Larisa is talking about at the end of her point there is that we collaborate together. We learn to use these tools to be able to work in a way that we could never previously have achieved. And I guess that some of what we've done during this period of online learning has enabled more of a transformation with those technological tools than perhaps we might have seen in the past, and a great opportunity there. I love the use of your word momentum there, by the way, Larisa. I absolutely agree with you. When we all get back into school, we can't sort of slow down in that process. I think there's been so many amazing achievements during the last few months. From a student perspective, I mean, there was a lot covered there by both Carolyn and Larisa. What do you think we should be keeping when we get back to school when it comes to the experience you've had over the last couple of months? Adrian, if we maybe start with you.
I think that we should kind of keep independent learning framework within there, because over these past few weeks, right, we've been much more independent with our work. We've been learning a lot more, and it's with this period of time, it might have been harder at the start with the social isolation and stuff, but over this period of time, we started to become more independent with our learning, and we started to further our own learning in our own pace and following with the teacher's guidelines. And I think that's one thing which everyone in school can take back.
And I guess we shouldn't forget as well, things like the student-led consultation evenings and things like that have moved online too. It's going to be very interesting to see going forward whether we retain any of those elements, perhaps. Manya, did you want anything to add there?
Yes, I think I agree with Adrian about the independent learning, because when this whole quarantine period started, it was hard for us to adjust to this. But now it's it helped us become more independent in this and much more proactive and active. And it's we're much more involved within the subject, which I feel like we should keep. Additionally, also, how we do breakout rooms during Zooms and all those private talks we have with our teachers, which makes us have a better understanding of the topic. I feel like we should try keeping that, maybe these split into tiny groups so we can understand topics to a further more in-depth extent, maybe.
Yeah, some very interesting ideas there. We'll maybe come back to some of those in a moment, Manya. I'm going to bring the primary specialists in as well. I'm just going to first of all play an example from Stephen Fennelly over at Bradbury School, who's talking about what he would like to see kept when it comes to the students finally getting back to Bradbury School.
Hi, yes, and thanks very much for having me. What I think that Bradbury should keep from the online learning experience when the children do eventually come back to school is the brilliant positive attitude that the teachers and the students have all displayed throughout this time. The teachers have been creating some fantastic videos. They've been using some new apps such as Padlet. They're utilizing platforms such as Google Classroom really well and really getting to grips with these platforms that they were perhaps just brushing past in the past. They've been flipping the classroom, but mostly what I really love to see everyone continue with is that positive attitudes towards trying new things and teachers trusting themselves and their students that if they don't get it right the first time, it doesn't matter, but to adapt and to try again.
Some interesting comments there from Stephen. Matt, I'm curious to know more about the online learning experience for those in primary schools, just adding on to Stephen Fennelly's comments there. I'm guessing that for many, this has been a very new, possibly even quite a daunting experience. So how would you gauge the progress of the QBS students during this time?
Yeah, well, I think we've made great progress with our students, and their confidence and competence in using technology to complete distance learning has come on immensely. For our youngest students, their experience of even using technology is generally being based on using an app which gives them instant feedback. They may have had some experience of video connections with family members in faraway places, but really the idea of communicating with a teacher online is something that's alien to them. And again, having to wait for the feedback from the activities they do is not something that they've ever had experience of in their use of technology. They've been used to apps which give them instant feedback.
It seems to me that that's some commonality that we've got across both primary and the secondary, kind of independence that both Carolyn and Larisa, and in fact from our student perspectives as well, have outlined. That there is a very, very different context to the learning as compared to what happens in a face-to-face environment that I think we're only probably now just starting to fully understand. I'm just going to play a quick audio piece from Stephen in terms of his response with regards to how the students have coped over at Bradbury as well, just to give a bit more balance there.
I have to say that the students have all done brilliantly during this online learning period. It's obviously been easier for the older students in terms of their access of different apps and platforms, but the younger ones have done fantastically as well. They've managed to continue their work on Seesaw, which they were used to in class, which was helpful for them, but they've been uploading their offline work onto their Seesaw platform so that their classmates and their teacher can comment on a daily basis. Speaking as a parent, watching my daughter, who's in year 4, watching her self-management skills improve over this period has been really good. She's managed to work out a timetable. She is excited to start her work at the start of the day. She gets everything done. I think that it's been a difficult but helpful experience for some of the children. The online learning can be self-paced at primary school, which is helpful. There are lots of videos that the children can rewind, rewatch, and then do their work. And that's been really helpful for some of the children that learn in this way. But there have been other children that have appreciated having one-to-one Zooms with members of staff to help them work through the day. So we've managed to work our way through this period, and the children have done really well.
Well done to Stephen's daughter. Stephen's got a bit of a kind of soul singer's voice, don't you think? I think that might be an alternative career for him. Carolyn, what about in terms of the secondary side of things? What have you seen there in terms of the student response?
It's interesting just listening to the primary and the secondary and the prioritization that the primary children have over our secondary students. And Adrian, you might be able to jump in here because you were talking about the independence and the freedom you have to set your own schedule. We still follow our timetable quite rigidly, and making sure that, because of course our school is so much bigger and we have many teachers that you have to access. But the prioritization is what I was talking about, where my son can spend a lot of time on one thing and then very quickly get something else done if he feels that he's quicker at doing that, as opposed to not having the skills and needing more time to complete something else. I found that was quite fascinating. Of the students at our school, what I have found with them, I think, and I just keep going back to that, it is the independence of knowing I need to get this done. Now my teacher is there, I can ask questions, but I also have the freedom to try it out myself and to make the mistakes and then maybe go back and ask those questions. The talk of breakout rooms, I think it's a really valuable example where the children still have independence, they're gone off, the teacher's not necessarily there, but can be called in at any given time. It's a really different way of looking at it. We use breakout rooms in our own classes, but we're all still together. That sense of independence maybe is not as great as what we're having because we have to adjust and we're doing everything online.
Adrian, Miss Andrews did mention you there. Do you want to come back on any of the points that she just made?
Oh yeah, I totally agree with the idea that we're becoming more independent now, but I think that especially during this time, our independent learning skills and our own self-study skills have just been improved exponentially because it's a very new situation for all of us. I mean, okay, we had about a week in November where we had to study at home, but it's over this last 4 months. I think that we've all grown as learners. I think that it's a kind of a really great experience, not only for right now, but in the future when you say you go to university as such. These skills are so transferable and they're really good, essentially.
And of course, this is the kind of inquiry-based learning that we've been working on for years in schools and maybe having taken a big step forward because of the situation that we're in. I should also mention that in Stephen's contribution there, he mentioned a platform called Seesaw. Now, again, some listeners, you're perhaps not really sure what that is, especially for the South Island School students. We don't use that platform, but it's kind of like a simpler version in some ways of Google Classroom. So it's a very similar type of setup. It's used actually by my wife in her primary school teaching. Talking about platforms, we've obviously, and some of you have been talking about Zoom there. We've talked a lot about Zoom during podcast episodes 1 and 2. But I guess I'd like to sort of find out which other platforms have been central to the approach, and also how effective do you think they have been in your opinion, maybe starting with you, Matt, over at Quarry Bay. So what sort of platforms and tools have you been throwing into the mix for your students?
Well, because we had very limited experience of apps and systems for doing any kind of e-learning or online learning, we had to start with something that all the students were familiar with. So we built a Google site for each year group, with each class having a page on Google Sites. Initially, we weren't doing any Zooms or video conferencing of any sort. The teachers were simply recording videos every morning to introduce the learning for the day, to check in with the students in that way. So our students became used to seeing their teacher every day on video. We had a daily register through a Google form, which the students filled in, and we used a Padlet wall for student check-ins so they could communicate with the teacher within the Google site itself. I think in terms of how effective it's been, once our students and teachers, for that matter, were comfortable with the systems that we had in place, then they could become more confident in exploring video conferencing and different use of technology tools.
Great opportunity nevertheless, eh? I mean, especially with all the video tools that are in use there. I actually have a friend over at Kennedy School. He's been using videos every morning for his primary school class, and he's literally been dressing up as a different character every day. I mean, it's been like this kind of, theatre course that the students are experiencing alongside online learning. So there's been some really inventive, creative work going on out there. I'm just going to play the response from Stephen over at Bradbury School in terms of what kind of platforms are being used there and how they compare to QBS for you, Matt.
Well, there's been quite a few different platforms that have been central to our approach. The main one has been the Google Suite for Education, mostly using Google Classroom from year 3 up to year 6, whereas the year 1s and 2s have used a lot of Seesaw. Year 1s have also created a website that's updated daily on Google Sites. In terms of teachers contacting the children and vice versa, we began by using Google Meets, as this was part of our G Suite for Education group of apps. And then when our foundation bought a foundation-wide Zoom license, we then moved on to Zoom. In terms of different apps, probably the one that's been most successful to run alongside the classroom has been Padlet. The children and the teachers find this very easy to both set up and to use to comment on. A good collaborative platform to use.
Yeah, I would second that comment there at the end from Stephen in terms of Padlet. And in fact, there's been a lovely initiative going on in school this week where the teachers have just been leaving a quick notice for one another, just as a pat on the back. And obviously, there's been so much support being provided across the school, as everyone has been pulling together in the last couple of months. So that's been great to see. I mentioned at the beginning of the show that the Digital Leadership Council has been building connections with both Quarry Bay and Bradbury, actually over the last, I'd say, 18 months. And this has involved trips to both schools for our digital leaders, with a focus so far on digital citizenship, a very, very important issue, one that my colleague Lucy Purvis talked quite extensively about last week. And later this month, we're also going to be starting to look at things like instructional technologies, which means our digital leaders will have the chance to teach some things about the tech itself to the younger students, which I know is something that Matt was very keen on happening in our discussions earlier on this year. If I can maybe bring Adrian in here and then perhaps Matt, generally speaking, do you agree with the approach whereby younger students are more likely to react positively to older students than to teachers when it comes to cyber safety issues? That's been put out there by experts over the last few years, and it's something that we have been practicing really through this relationship via the DLC. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Adrian, if we can start with you.
Yeah, I would agree with the idea that kind of younger students are more likely to react positively or more receptive towards like kind of these cyber safety issues when it comes to like the basis of understanding them, because given that it's such a new concept for them, they're certainly more open to kind of like these new ideas of cyber safety compared to like older students who may have had to experience something bad before they took these learning steps. And now like they kind of like understand these pitfalls and such, and given their lack of exposure towards these apps, I think they would be more receptive towards learning about these cyber safety issues.
Yeah, I mean, it almost feels like if a teacher is telling the student, maybe for the students, it's just yet another lecture about what they shouldn't do online, or they're trying to stop us from having fun or whatever it might be. But when it's an older student, perhaps it's then, an anecdote, or it's an experience that the younger students can relate to, perhaps. Matt, what's your take on this from a primary perspective?
Yeah, I think it's really great if the younger students get to learn from the experiences of older students, particularly if they haven't had much access to technology at home, or they're not allowed to use technology much at home as well. I think the biggest concern for many of our parents is screen time, and for our teachers too as well. And really, it's emerging now. I mean, you see it through this period of school closures and the coronavirus across the world, that it's probably the quality of the screen time rather than the quantity of the screen time and what people are using with screen time. So, I mean, for students with a blanket ban, or if they have a time limit, then perhaps learning from the experience of older students in the pitfalls, the challenges, the potential dangers of using technology is really beneficial and really positive for them.
Some really good points there. And that's something that hopefully when the digital leaders get the chance to get down to QBS later this month, we'll see how that goes. And maybe we can follow that up in a future podcast and see how effective that was. Manya, if I could bring you in on the discussion at this stage, I mean, it seems to me that we've something of a crossover between the focus of our second podcast, which dealt with student and staff wellbeing, and then the pedagogical methods that we've been discussing on the show today. As a senior student, do you think online learning and the different methods employed by teachers has kind of increased or decreased stress?
First, that's a very good question. And I feel there are two sides of the argument. For instance, the methods used by the teachers have actually decreased levels of stress, such as a one-to-one with student discussions in breakout rooms, as it builds a more in-depth analysis and understanding of the subject. And additionally, in a way, it motivates students to do more in the 2 hours, as some of us aren't exactly distracted like we normally are in school environments. And it's more effective and more efficient as we get to do more activities and more research on the topic or subject area. However, it can be a bit stressful, especially if you're required to do group discussions, as we need communicate more human talking, and it's just hard for some of us.
It's interesting to get that take from you there, Manya, because I mean, last week we had Chloe Jazzy Lauer on the show, who's a year 11 student, and she was pointing out that for some students, the fact that they're not being seen perhaps by the rest of the class, so their reaction or is more muted even if the video cameras are on, perhaps students are more free to say what they would perhaps want to say with less of a sense of judgment when you're not, literally sat staring at the student across the class and you're worried about what the reaction might be. Has that been the case for you? I mean, or for your peers, would you say?
I would say no, because most of us, we prefer it with the camera on, as like we can see each other's like body movement, we can see what we're trying to say. I mean, that's the case for some of us, though I'm not sure about everyone in class.
That's a really interesting point, and very topical as well. It's something that's being discussed by the staff at the moment in terms of, our protocol is evolving over time. And, at the beginning of the process, we tended to prioritize audio, but for exactly the reasons that you just articulated, there is more and more of a desire now to try and get those video cameras on where we can, so we can connect more on a human level with the students in the class. Adrian, what about from your perspective?
I would totally agree with Manya's point, but I think for like some classes, the lack of interaction, it's really great that you have no cameras on sometimes. If you think you're going off tangent, you don't really feel like that sense of judgment like you kind of would in class. But I think in some like the core subjects, such as biology or like maths or such, if you're going off on a tangent and you don't have a video camera on, you can't really gauge, what am I saying? Is it right? Is it wrong? I do not have a clue. And I think we need this kind of interaction for such in maths and other core subjects, so in that way you can like gauge the responses which will happen and so on.
Absolutely. So there's no one size fits all experience here. There's a big range across various different subjects, and of course the pedagogy that's been employed there. Carolyn, we've obviously had the benefit of lots of surveys to parents and students alike. I mean, what kind of things have come from those in your opinion?
It's really interesting. The statistics that come back will say that the mental stress, the general happiness of both the staff and the students is quite high. They will take the time to make a comment to say, yeah, I know people are working hard for me. Yes, I appreciate all the support. And that's both teachers and students. But it will always follow with the lines between school and home are now blurred. So the idea of being on our screens a lot more, the idea of probably working a lot longer than we usually did. We didn't take our breaks. You just knew when your work was finished. And I do find that even with some of the students, when they're responding to say they don't have their lunch breaks anymore, they don't have any free time, whereas you had to move. End of lesson, you moved, you went to your next class. Same as teachers. Okay, we're finished the day. It's getting a bit late. We want to go home and then start doing things at home. But we're in our home. So it just never stops. It's endless. So based on surveys, everybody is they're just lovely people. And that's the bottom line with South Island School. But we have to be very careful in these procedures and policies that we're putting in place. It is to ensure that we are making absolute sure that people are taking care of their well-being. Because at the end of the day, sometimes we don't do that. The kids come first.
Yeah, that division between the private and the public has merged together, has the line between those two kind of spheres. Following on from what Carolyn has just said there, I mean, Larisa and Matt, just to bring you on the kind of staff side of things, there is stress here for teachers, isn't there? Above and beyond just the separation between private and public. My wife was telling me the other day that she was talking to one of her primary school students, and he was saying, but you only have to create one Zoom every day, and what else are you doing with your time? And he doesn't see the marking that's going on, the preparation that goes into that, the emails to the parents, et cetera, et cetera. So, what do you think the stress levels have been? Do you think they've been increased for staff at QBS in South Island? Maybe Larisa, if we start with you.
Well, I think in the early days, stress levels were very high. Obviously, in the first instance, because of the situation. And then your attention turns to the pressure that you put on yourself to want to provide high quality teaching and learning experiences for the students to maintain that, even though you're now teaching in a virtual space rather than a physical space. So I think here it comes down to the support that teachers are given. As I mentioned before, we've experienced this incredibly steep learning curve in terms of how we do things. And I think the support probably could have been better. It's a real pity that we don't already have instructional coaches in school, because if we did, we could have harnessed that and, as I said, met teachers where they're at. I think it's going to vary depending on who you are and what your previous experience of using technology to teach is. I have quite a lot of experience already, but I still had to adapt that for an online delivery. And, I found that it didn't take me long to learn new tools, new platforms. But what did take time was thinking about how I could use those effectively in this situation. And I certainly found I was up very late most days for the first few weeks, just preparing, planning, adapting things, getting everything ready for the following day, and doing all those things that Carolyn was talking about, not taking breaks. It was just work.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we're talking about such a a wide range of skills there. Staff who are very, very comfortable with digital technologies and love using them in lessons, and others who are maybe just dipping their toe into the water. And I've said on previous shows, I'll say it again, the upskilling that's happened. I'm not saying that that's been without stress. I think you're right, Larisa, for many, many staff, it's been a stressful journey for them. But I do think that there has been an extraordinary development in the way that teachers are using digital technologies. Certainly in my training in school, in my role of digital literacy coordination, I would never have been able to achieve it in the same way. Matt, what about over at QBS? What's the stress levels been like for teachers over there?
Yeah, well, I think in any time of change that there's inevitably a degree of stress for teachers, but I think we took a really measured approach. Myself and the leadership team, we trialed different video conferencing solutions. We looked at Google Meet. We looked at using Zoom before we rolled them out with the school, and we put a lot of time and effort into sort of laying those foundations before we unleashed our expectations on the classroom teachers, so to speak. I think it's been really great for me to be able to support teachers in resilience rather than straight up tech skills. Before, they might have asked me how to do a certain thing with a certain app, but now it's more about how they can solve problems independently because they're obviously not in school and they don't want to be calling me, texting me, emailing me all the time as well. So I think it's been really great that we've been able to say, if you're not sure, just try it. If you don't know how to do something, do a Google search. And, most of the time, if something goes wrong, it's probably something to do with the technology rather than what you've done. Yeah, and I think with what we've seen with Zoom and the security concerns and the updates that have happened with the Zoom software, it's really illustrated to our teachers that our technology is not perfect. It does have to change. It will change. Things won't work as we anticipate them, and that we just have to be relaxed a little bit when things don't go as we expect them to.
And that's okay. It's okay for those things not to work all the time and not necessarily get too stressed about things. Very interesting to note there that for both students and for staff, there has been a development of independent skills. It comes back to that sort of lifelong learning, where it's never too late to learn those skills. Larisa, you talked earlier about the experimentation, and I know that as a practitioner, you've tried a lot of different things that you're alluding to in your last response. You've been working with Pear Deck, Screencastify, Classcraft more recently, and many other digital tools during this period of time. Do any of these stand out for you as an offering? Which ones do you think have the most potential?
I think the first thing to remember is that it's actually not about the technology, it's about the learning. And so it's very important that, as you're developing your understanding, part of that is developing an understanding of how do you choose the right tool for what you're trying to achieve. So that could be the learning outcomes, or as we've seen, one of the issues that people were concerned about with the online learning was monitoring engagement. And so it turned out that Pear Deck was fantastic for that. And a byproduct of it was that it also increases engagement as well. And I think that's partly because students feel they have a voice. It's easier for them to contribute. It's not quite so public as putting your hand up in class. So I think that's the most important thing to say to start with. But I think there's two other things. There's the feedback cycle in particular that the technology is great for. And this is not just for an online virtual context, but a physical context as well. So using something like Screencastify to explain tasks, demonstrate or give instructions. You can provide success criteria, skills and strategies. And if you've used a screencast to do that, students can go back to it again and again. They don't have to remember everything that you told them. You can have students use it to reflect and set goals. You can personalize feedback using commenting tools, including video and audio feedback, and also digital platforms like Padlet support peer feedback as well. I've had some success with that, in a way that seems much more meaningful than just asking them to talk to each other. You can use quizzes, polls, and surveys, so Google Forms, for example, to get feedback from students as well about how they're getting on with what you're giving them to do using the technology to achieve the outcomes. I actually used Classcraft for the first time this week, and at the end I asked them to give me some feedback about how they'd found it. Did they like it? What did they like about it? And it was really good to hear that from them. Many of them told me they enjoyed the self-pacing of it, and so getting that feedback means that I can keep on doing those things. And then, yes, as you said, it's this idea of creativity and playfulness. And I think Matt mentioned it before, bringing flipped learning and blended learning approaches into the classroom, incorporating elements of gamification, so learning quests, achievements, leveling up, and, as you know, my favourite, badges. But I think also remembering student creativity and playfulness as well, challenging them to create films, animations, infographics, or podcasts, or their own screencasts to show their learning and, of course, develop their digital literacy and citizenship skills alongside that.
Yep, that's a great response, Larisa. And congratulations on your Screencastify badge, which I managed to get as well last week, everybody. You'll be proud to know. I've got to develop my own skills at the same time as well. Carolyn, would you like to come in at this point as well, seeing things more holistically across the school? There's a whole number of things that were mentioned there by Larissa's point, but anything that you'd follow up on that?
Well, I don't have near as many badges as you guys have, so that's something I'm going to shoot for. That's it. I've decided I'm going to get my classes doing the same thing. No, I thought what Larisa said was brilliant. It is all about choosing the right tool to satisfy a need that you have in your own particular classroom. If I'm the one that seems to be talking too much and the engagement from the kids is low, then there are some applications that we could use to get the kids more engaged. I thought it was brilliant that staff have been playing with platforms. We have not mandated certain platforms. We don't want to overstimulate our staff either. We know how busy they are. But they're picking and choosing what they feel is right for them. Larisa put on a lovely workshop for Pedagogy, and the staff who attended had the confidence to then go and try it. Some of the ones that she mentioned, some of the things that I've done in my own classroom, for example, and I've heard from a number of teachers, they would lecture, but then the kids may not retain what it was that happened in the lecture. Maybe they're not great at taking notes, maybe there are other issues. But what I found with Screencastify, for example, that's gone, that's been eliminated, in that the children are able to go back to the videos and they're able to review the work that has happened. So again, I'm not going to go in depth because Larisa was fantastic as what she has just described. But I think staff generally are now looking at technology in a much, much different way.
I would agree with that. And it's a really good point about Screencastify use. The opportunity to just play things back for students in their own time, I think is something that we can all learn going forward. That is probably just about all we have time for today. I'd like to thank my guests for their thoughtful contributions today. Episode 4 is coming soon and we'll focus on the relationship between technology and the future of work. We're going to have some outside guests coming from all manner of different sectors, so it should be an interesting one, and even a representative from the business department as well. So if you have any thoughts or questions or feedback, then please write to digileaders@webmail.sis.edu.hk. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon.